In 1937, the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, was no different than any other dusty rural town in the American Midwest. Families worked hard to survive. The land was the lifeblood of the community, and the hum of daily life continued on, almost unnoticed. My name is Ruby Callahan, and my story begins here, in a humble cottage on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and fresh hay, and every morning, I watched the sunrise from our small porch, a habit I've never lost. My father, Thomas Callahan, was a hard-working man. He was a farmhand, tending to the fields of Franklin Cross, the most respected rancher in the area. My mother, Esther, spent her days making cheese and selling it at the market. We lived in a modest home, always just scraping by, but it was an honest life. We had everything we needed, each other, our land, and the knowledge that we were doing what we could to survive. So if you're watching, baby, go ahead and like this video, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. 'Cause this ain't just my story. It's the story of too many women who had to smile through the silence. The world was simpler back then, and as a child, I had never once questioned our place in it. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor enough to worry about where our next meal would come from. That was all about to change, however, in a way that would shape my entire future. When I was 14 years old, tragedy struck. My father fell ill with an infection, and within days, he was gone. The loss left a gaping hole in my heart, one that would never fully heal. But life didn't stop for grief. My mother and I struggled to keep going. She became withdrawn, unable to carry the weight of both our hearts. I knew I had to step up. By the time I was 16, I found work on the Cross Ranch as a cook and housekeeper. Franklin Cross, the owner of the largest ranch in Cedar Falls, was a powerful man, someone people respected and feared. My father had worked for him for many years, and Franklin was known for treating his workers well. He took a special interest in me, perhaps because I reminded him of the daughters he and his wife, Margaret, had never had. Life in the Cross household was unlike anything I had known. They offered me a bed in their house, a steady wage, and even a tutor to help me improve my literacy. I learned quickly about ranching, business, and life beyond the world I had known. Franklin took me under his wing, calling me his right-hand woman, and boasting about my business acumen. "Ruby has more business sense than most men in suits," he would proudly declare. But even as he offered me kindness, something in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Franklin Cross was a man of power, and power, though it can protect you, can also corrupt. As I grew older, I began to sense a shift in the Cross household. I had lived with them for years, and Margaret, though loving, had become a shadow of the woman I had once known. She had lost several children during childbirth, and the pain had never left her eyes. Franklin and Margaret became like parents to me, and yet, I couldn't help but feel like something was slowly changing in their relationship with me. I married James, a quiet ranch hand, when I was 22, against Franklin's wishes. He had never liked James, claiming he was a simple man with no ambition. 6 months later, James left, leaving nothing but a note. He was gone, and I was devastated. Franklin welcomed me back with open arms, comforting me with words that seemed sincere at the time. I didn't see it then, but looking back now, I wonder, did Franklin see my vulnerability as a way to keep me under his control? I trusted him, as I always had, but I began to wonder if my loyalty had been misplaced. It was during the summer of 1972, when I was 35 years old, that I learned of my Uncle Gerald's passing. To my surprise, he had left me a piece of land. I immediately assumed it was worthless, a dry patch of desert that no one would want. I didn't even think twice when Franklin insisted on handling the paperwork for me. "You're like a daughter to me, Ruby," he said. "Let me take care of this for you." 2 weeks later, a geologist by the name of Lloyd Harper knocked on my door. He had a map with him and, with excitement in his eyes, he spread it out on my kitchen table. "This land," he said, "is sitting on one of the largest concentrations of silver and turquoise I've ever seen. It's worth a fortune." I was floored. The land that had once seemed so insignificant now had a value beyond my comprehension. I called Franklin right away, and he returned from Phoenix 2 days later. But the warmth in his eyes was gone. He was no longer the father figure I had trusted. Instead, he had become someone I couldn't recognize, cold, calculating, distant. "You don't need to sell," Franklin said when I explained the offer. "That man's trying to cheat you. The land is worth 10 times more. Let me handle it for you." His tone was commanding, his usual fatherly warmth replaced by something else, something darker. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at the ranch changed. Franklin became more secretive, and Margaret seemed increasingly withdrawn. Even the ranch hands, who had always greeted me warmly, now looked at me with suspicion. It was as though a cloud had descended on the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I tried to put my worries aside, but when I visited the county clerk's office, I learned the horrifying truth. Franklin had forged my signature and transferred the land into his own name. The shock of it was like a punch to the gut. I had trusted him, and he had betrayed me in the worst possible way. For the first time, I felt the full weight of the world crashing down on me. My life, which had seemed so stable and secure, had crumbled in an instant. I had been betrayed by the very man I had considered family. But even in the face of such devastating loss, I knew I couldn't just give up. The weight of betrayal crushed me in ways I could never have imagined. Franklin Cross, the man I had called my protector, my father, had stolen everything from me. He had stolen my future, my dignity, and the land I had been left by my late uncle. But worse than the loss of property was the brutal realization that he had attempted to bury me alive to claim what wasn't his. That night, after learning about the forged documents, I stayed up in a daze, pacing the floor of the small cottage where I lived on the ranch. The air felt thick, like the walls were closing in on me. My stomach churned, and I could feel the fear creep up my spine like a cold, invisible hand. The land, the one thing that could change my life, had been taken from me. Worse yet, Franklin had orchestrated my death in order to do so. The idea of it, the audacity, the cruelty, it was too much to bear. Yet, somehow, the betrayal I had just discovered was nothing compared to the betrayal that was still to come. The next morning, Margaret called me into the main house for tea. The same tea I had shared with her countless times. The same tea I had sipped from her hands without question. I should have known, should have felt the coldness in the air, but my heart was too broken to notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. She had always been a motherly figure to me, offering warmth and kindness, a contrast to Franklin's coldness. But today there was something off about her smile. It was too tight, too forced. "Ruby, dear, sit with me," Margaret said, her voice soft as she poured the tea into my cup. I watched her movements, the way her hands trembled slightly as she handed me the cup, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The tea tasted bitter. Too bitter, in fact. But I drank it all, swallowing the strange sensation in my throat, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. It wasn't until moments later that I began to feel the effects. My vision blurred, and the world around me spun. I tried to rise from my chair, but my legs buckled beneath me. My breath grew shallow, and my body felt as if it were made of lead. The last thing I saw before the world turned black was Franklin, standing by the door with a look of cold satisfaction on his face. The next thing I knew, I was trapped. The world was muffled, and the air was thick and stagnant. My chest tightened as I realized where I was, buried in the earth, my body cocooned in a wooden coffin. The smell of damp wood and soil filled my senses. The darkness pressed down on me, and for a moment, I thought it was the end. But then something shifted inside me. A surge of primal fear and anger flooded my body. I was not going to die here. Not like this. Not at the hands of someone I had trusted. The last few moments before I lost consciousness were a blur, but I remember the soft scraping sound of the shovel as it hit the lid of the coffin. Each thud was a hammer blow to my chest, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Franklin had buried me alive, sealed me in a tomb, and now he was going to walk away with everything I had worked for. He believed that was the end of me, but he was wrong. The darkness was suffocating, but it was also the beginning of something. In that grave, I found a part of myself that I never knew existed. A part that was determined, fierce, and unwilling to give up. I knew I couldn't just lie there and accept my fate. With trembling hands, I fumbled in my pockets, feeling for anything that could help. I found a hairpin, the simplest tool, but it became my salvation. With desperate determination, I used the pin to begin the painful task of scraping at the lid of the coffin. The dirt was thick, and the wood felt unyielding. Each movement was slow and agonizing, but I kept going. Every scrape brought me closer to freedom. Time blurred in that confined space, but I refused to stop. My hands bled, my body screamed in pain, but my will to live burned stronger than anything else. I could hear the sound of my breath, ragged and shallow, echoing in the dark, and with each gasp, I knew that I was not ready to die. The moment stretched into what felt like an eternity, but eventually my efforts paid off. The lid of the coffin shifted. I had made a small opening, just enough to let in a sliver of fresh air. It was the smallest of victories, but it felt like a triumph. The first real sign that I was going to make it out of this grave. I didn't know how long I had been buried, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to die here. With the hairpin, I scraped and scraped, finally managing to break through the coffin's lid. My hands were raw, and my body felt as if it were falling apart, but the small opening gave me enough to pull myself out. I clawed my way up, feeling the weight of the earth pressing down on me, suffocating me. But there was something else too, something stronger than the dirt. It was the will to survive, the instinct to rise. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the surface. I had no idea where I was. The world seemed upside down, and I could barely keep my eyes open. But I had made it out. I had survived. The desert stretched around me, barren and unforgiving. The air was dry, and the sun beat down on me, but I stumbled forward, every step fueled by sheer willpower. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back to the ranch. Not after everything that had happened. I remember feeling like a ghost, a shadow of the woman I had once been. I couldn't even remember the last time I had felt this terrified, this powerless. But as I walked through the desert, each step forward became a step toward reclaiming my life. The betrayal that had once crushed me now felt like the fuel that would carry me to the next chapter. The sun bore down on me like an unforgiving taskmaster, and the land stretched endlessly before me, a barren sea of sand and rock. My throat felt as though it had been scraped raw, the dryness threatening to consume me entirely. My hands, bloodied and bruised from the desperate escape, trembled with exhaustion. I was barely conscious, each step a struggle to keep moving, to keep breathing. I had no idea how long I had been walking, or how far I had traveled, but I knew one thing. I could never return to the ranch. I had to disappear. The man who had buried me alive, Franklin Cross, was not someone I could ever face again. Not until I was ready. Not until I had the strength to take back what he had stolen from me. I don't know how long I wandered through the desert. The minutes, the hours, the days all blurred together. But I couldn't afford to rest for too long. I knew that if I collapsed, if I allowed myself to succumb to the weight of my body and the brutal heat, it would be the end. I couldn't let Franklin win. Not like this. By the time I reached the San Pedro River, I was half mad with thirst, delirious from the heat, and the days without food. My body had become a shell, hollow and aching, every movement sending searing pain through my limbs. It was here, along the bank of the river, that I collapsed, utterly defeated. My heart, once filled with the fire of survival, now seemed to have little left to give. But the universe, or perhaps fate, had a different plan. I heard the rustling of leaves, the soft crackle of dry branches, and the smell of something burning, perhaps of fire or incense. I tried to lift my head, but it felt like the earth itself was holding me down. That's when I saw her. A figure appeared, an old woman, her face weathered by time and hardship, but her eyes were sharp, filled with a quiet knowledge of the world that only comes from living through its hardest trials. She was Ida, the midwife of Cedar Falls, known by all for her wisdom and her quiet strength. Ida had always been something of a local legend, a woman who had brought life into the world for countless families, a woman who could heal wounds with herbs and prayers. But what few people knew was that she was also a survivor, someone who had seen the depths of human suffering and still managed to find peace. When she found me lying on the ground, she didn't ask questions. She didn't judge. She simply lifted me with surprising strength and carried me to her humble home, a small wattle and dog hut hidden among the trees by the river. It wasn't much, just a simple, one-room structure made of dried mud and straw, but it was enough. For the first time in days, I felt safe. Ida didn't speak much in those first hours. She knew what I needed: rest, food, water. She treated my wounds, applied a foul-smelling paste to my hands, and wrapped them in clean clothes. Her touch was gentle, and though I was weak and trembling, I felt something I hadn't felt in days: hope. Over the next few days, I could feel my body slowly recovering. The fever that had racked me from dehydration began to subside, and my strength returned in small bursts. But more than that, I began to feel something else, a quiet resolve building inside of me. I had survived Franklin's betrayal. I had survived the grave. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. One evening, after the sun had set and the cool desert air began to settle in, Ida sat across from me, a small clay pipe in her hands, the smoke curling into the air like a ghostly reminder of the past. She spoke softly, her words like the steady rhythm of a lullaby. "You're lucky to be alive, child," she said, her voice gravelly but kind. "I've seen many come through here, some with less reason to fight, and none with the fire you've got." I didn't answer her right away. My mind was racing, filled with the images of Franklin's cold face, of the betrayal that had cost me everything. The anger that had once consumed me now had purpose, it had a target. I finally looked at Ida, meeting her gaze. "I need to make sure he never does this to anyone again," I said, my voice hoarse but determined. "I'll expose him. I'll take back what's mine." Ida's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly, as if she had expected me to say those very words. Then we'll need proof, she said. You'll need to find the documents, the ones that show how he's wronged you. And you'll need to make sure you have witnesses. It was then that I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just walk away from Cedar Falls and let Franklin win. He had robbed me of everything, but he hadn't taken my will to fight. I would return, not as the woman who had been buried alive, but as a force to be reckoned with. But first, I needed to find the evidence. I needed to find proof that Franklin Cross had forged the land transfer, that he had poisoned me, and that his plans had been built on lies and betrayal. Ida was right, the law was my weapon, and I had to wield it carefully. That's when I decided to seek out Michael, Ida's son. He worked at the county clerk's office, a quiet man with thick glasses and a reputation for being honest and reliable. I'd known Michael from my younger years, but I had never spoken to him much. However, Ida assured me that he was trustworthy, that he could help me uncover the truth. He'll help you, Ida said one night, after I had shared my plan. He has more courage than you think, and he's always hated the injustice Franklin brings to this town. The next morning, Ida sent Michael to me. I told him everything, and at first, he was in shock. He couldn't believe it, couldn't believe that Franklin had gone so far. But as I spoke, I could see the fire of justice in his eyes. I'll help you, Ruby, Michael said firmly. I'll get the documents you need. I'll expose him. With Michael's help, I began the long road to recovery, both physically and mentally. But it was also the beginning of my journey for justice. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but I was no longer afraid. I had survived the worst that Franklin Cross had thrown at me. The man who had once been a father figure, who had shown me kindness, was now my greatest enemy. But I was determined to take back what he had stolen. I would rise from the grave, not just to survive, but to rebuild. And so, the fight for redemption began. The days that followed my recovery felt like a blur of preparation, exhaustion, and fleeting moments of clarity. I had escaped the grave, but now I had to face the reality of my situation. Franklin Cross had stolen not just my land, but my very life, and I couldn't let that stand. As the days passed, my resolve grew stronger. The sense of urgency that had once been a quiet hum in the back of my mind became a pounding drumbeat, pushing me forward, demanding action. In the small, humble hut by the river, where I had once felt like a broken woman, I now felt something new, purpose. My hands were still scarred from the struggle to claw my way out of the coffin, but each scar was a badge of survival, a testament to my strength. With Ida's wisdom and Michael's quiet determination, I began to see the path that lay before me. Michael worked quickly, quietly, gathering the evidence we would need to expose Franklin's lies. He had access to every document filed at the Cedar Falls County Clerk's office, and with that access, he began to pull the threads of Franklin's scheme apart. Every forged signature, every false transaction, every lie that Franklin had carefully constructed, it was all there, waiting to be uncovered. When Michael first brought me the documents, I nearly froze. The sheer magnitude of Franklin's deception was staggering. The land transfer, signed in my name but never by me, the death certificate that had never been authorized, and worst of all, the contracts with mining companies that had been sealed with my supposed death as a means to exploit my inheritance. Franklin had covered every angle, thinking that no one would question his authority. But he had underestimated one thing: he had underestimated me. Ida, ever the practical woman, helped me sort through the pile of documents. We carefully compiled them into a portfolio, the evidence stacked against Franklin as high as the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread when I looked at the stack. This was the moment when everything would change. The confrontation was inevitable. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced death. And now I was going to face Franklin, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. The plan was simple. I would return to Cedar Falls under a different name, no longer Ruby Callahan, the woman who had been buried alive. I would return as a stranger, a woman from Phoenix, someone no one knew, and wait for the right moment. The grand inauguration that Franklin had planned for his mining venture was the perfect stage. All the influential figures from around the region, bankers, ranchers, politicians, would be there, watching as Franklin took his place as the new mining tycoon. He thought this event would cement his power, but it would be his downfall. The timing had to be perfect, and we only had a matter of weeks to prepare. In the days leading up to the event, I began to transform. I had to become someone else, someone who was unrecognizable to Franklin and the rest of Cedar Falls. My hair, once dark with strands of gray, was dyed a deep black using a mixture of herbs Ida had prepared. I practiced walking differently, more stooped, less confident, like a woman who had never known power. I adjusted my posture, forced myself to speak with a subtle accent, and even practiced a new name. Rosa Martinez was the name I would use, simple, unremarkable, and above all, forgettable. The scar on my chin, earned from the desperate struggle in the coffin, was healing, but I didn't want to hide it. It was a part of me now, a permanent mark of survival, a reminder of the journey I had undertaken. As I practiced my new identity, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of empowerment. I wasn't just reclaiming my land. I was reclaiming my life. On the morning of the inauguration, I stood before the mirror in Ida's hut, my reflection strange to my own eyes. The woman staring back at me was not the meek servant I had once been. She was someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal, someone who would not back down. Michael arrived early, nervously clutching the folder of documents. He had become more than an ally to me in the past weeks. He had become my friend, my confidant. I knew that without his help, none of this would have been possible. "We're ready," he said quietly, adjusting his glasses. "I'll be there, Ruby." "No, Rosa, just like we planned. But you'll have to be careful. If Franklin recognizes you before the right moment." "I'll be fine," I cut him off, though my heart was racing. "I've been through worse." He nodded, though I could see the concern in his eyes. Michael had always been a quiet, reserved man, but his loyalty was unwavering. The trip to Cedar Falls was brief but agonizing. As we passed the familiar landmarks, the Cedar Creek Bridge, the small general store where I had once worked, I felt a knot of anxiety twist in my gut. This town had been my home, and it had been my prison. The memories of my time with Franklin and Margaret flooded back. It was hard to reconcile the life I had once known with the woman I had become. The inauguration site was a spectacle. White tents stretched across the vast ranch, and the stage had been erected on a hill, overlooking the sprawling land that Franklin had claimed as his own. The banners fluttered in the wind, the air filled with the hum of excited chatter. People had gathered from miles around to see the birth of the Montgomery mining empire. Franklin's empire. As we approached the crowd, I could feel my pulse quicken. I kept my head low, my eyes scanning the sea of unfamiliar faces. But there were some I recognized: ranchers, bankers, politicians, all of them eager to curry favor with Franklin. The man who had buried me alive was about to make his grand entrance, and I would be ready. Franklin arrived, walking with Margaret by his side. He wore a new, expensive suit that looked out of place in this dusty town, and she wore an elegant dress that sparkled in the sunlight. They smiled and greeted guests as if they hadn't just conspired to murder me. As I watched them, a chill ran down my spine. Everything in me wanted to confront him right then and there. To walk up to him and reveal the truth to the world. But that wasn't the plan. Not yet. The ceremony began with speeches. The mayor of Cedar Falls praised Franklin for his vision and commitment to the community. A representative from the bank announced a multi-million-dollar loan that would secure Franklin's mining operation for years to come. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest like the slow approach of thunder. Every word was a reminder of the lies Franklin had built his empire on. Every moment was a reminder of the life he had tried to steal from me. Finally, Franklin Cross took the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment, I thought I might lose my resolve. But then I remembered why I was here. I wasn't here to watch him gloat. I was here to expose him. And that was exactly what I was going to do. The sun hung low in the sky as the speeches droned on, the crowd's murmurs blending into a distant hum. I stood in the shadows, watching, waiting. The cool evening air fluttered around me, the scent of fresh-cut grass mixing with the earth beneath my feet. Every moment of this night felt like the slow turning of a wheel, the tension building with each passing minute. The inauguration was more than just an event. It was Franklin's final victory, or, as I was determined to make it, his downfall. I had arrived at the ranch earlier in the day, dressed in my disguise, prepared for the role I had to play. Rosa Martinez, the woman from Phoenix, someone no one would recognize, a stranger in a crowd of familiar faces. Michael, ever the vigilant ally, kept close, though I could feel the weight of the plan pressing down on him too. He knew what was at stake, and I could see the quiet anxiety in his eyes as we maneuvered through the guests. The fine dress I wore, the veil on my face, the thick glasses that hid my identity, these were the tools of my transformation. The woman I had been, the woman who had been betrayed and buried alive, was gone. The woman standing here now had been reborn, her purpose clear. But as I watched Franklin Cross walk onto the stage, his arrogance almost palpable in the way he stood, chest puffed out, hands raised in greeting, something inside me tightened. He was the same man who had promised to protect me, to treat me as a daughter, and yet here he was standing in front of me as the man who had tried to kill me. His every word that night, his boastful speech about the future, the Montgomery mining empire, seemed like a mockery. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, I had once sat at his table, laughing with him and his wife. Now, I wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, but I stayed silent. Not yet. I watched as Franklin continued to speak about his great vision for the land, how it would transform the region, bring prosperity, and shape the future. But not a word about the truth. Not a word about the fact that the land he was now profiting from had been stolen from me. Not a word about how he had betrayed me. The audience, hanging on his every word, had no idea. To them, Franklin Cross was still the great rancher, the respected man who had built an empire. But in reality, he was nothing but a fraud, a man who had used deceit, manipulation, and murder to get what he wanted. My heart pounded in my chest as Franklin finally wrapped up his speech, raising a glass in a toast to new beginnings. The crowd cheered, but I could feel the adrenaline surge through my veins. This was it. This was the moment. Michael gave me a subtle nod from the back of the crowd, and I moved toward the stage. My legs felt heavy, as if each step was taking me closer to something inevitable. The guests were too busy clapping, too distracted by Franklin's grandiosity, to notice me. I wasn't afraid of being seen. This was my time, my moment to reveal everything. I made my way through the crowd, keeping my head low, walking in the same careful, almost timid manner I had practiced over the past few weeks. The disguise worked. No one seemed to recognize me, and I felt an odd sense of detachment from the world around me. This was no longer the Ruby who had been buried alive. This was Rosa, a woman with a purpose. When I reached the front of the stage, I took a deep breath. And then I removed my veil. The audience gasped. For a moment, Franklin didn't even register what had happened. His eyes were still locked on the crowd, still riding the high of his own success. But then, as the gasp echoed through the crowd, he turned slowly and locked eyes with me. His face was drained of color. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. He stood there, frozen in shock, his expression one of disbelief. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Nothing, Franklin," I said, my tone sharp, clear. "This land was mine. You stole it from me." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. The air seemed to freeze, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Franklin's face twisted with confusion, then panic. He opened his mouth again, but I didn't give him the chance to speak. "You poisoned me. You buried me alive to take what wasn't yours." The words spilled from me with a force I had never known. "And you thought you could get away with it." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was looking at me, at Franklin, at the woman they had believed to be dead. The disbelief was palpable, yet I could feel something else too. A growing sense of fear. The fear that Franklin had once instilled in everyone. The fear that had kept them all silent for so long. Michael appeared at my side, the documents in his hands. "This is Ruby Callahan," he said, his voice steady. "The true owner of the land. The woman who was declared dead, but who now stands here to expose the truth. These documents," he pulled the stack from the folder. "These documents prove it. They prove Franklin Cross's fraud, his forged signature, his conspiracy to murder." I could see Franklin's eyes flicker in panic. His facade was crumbling. The man who had once been invincible, untouchable, was now exposed for the world to see. "You buried me alive, Franklin," I said, my voice cold and unforgiving. "But you forgot one thing. You never checked to see if I was dead." At that moment, Franklin staggered back, his face twisting in horror. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. He clutched at his chest, as if the weight of his guilt was finally crushing him. And then, just as the chaos began to ripple through the crowd, he collapsed. "Heart attack," someone shouted, and the panic that had already been building erupted into chaos. In the midst of the frenzy, Margaret stood at the front, eyes wide in disbelief. She had been silent throughout my speech, but now, with Franklin crumpled on the stage, she seemed to realize that the world she had once known was unraveling. As the crowd moved in around Franklin, some to help, others to flee, Margaret turned and disappeared into the throng of people, her face filled with fear. But the damage had already been done. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. I stood there, in front of the crowd, staring at Franklin, who was now gasping for breath, clutching his chest in agony. The crowd was buzzing, whispers turning into shouts. Some were asking if it was a trick, others staring at the evidence in Michael's hands. I had done it. I had exposed him. But the moment was bittersweet. Franklin Cross had died as he had lived, surrounded by lies and power. Yet, it wasn't the triumph I had expected. His confession, though heard by dozens of witnesses, felt empty. Justice was not a victory to celebrate. It was a necessary reckoning, and in the end, it wasn't about Franklin. It was about me. About survival. About finding my voice after years of being silenced. The chaos that erupted around the stage after Franklin Cross collapsed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. There was no question now. Franklin had been unmasked, his empire built on lies and treachery crumbling before the very eyes of the community. The crowd surged, whispers rippling through the air like wildfire. Some people stared at me in disbelief, others in awe. But the one thing they all had in common was fear. The man they had once revered, the so-called pillar of the town, was now revealed to be a fraud. His carefully constructed image shattered in an instant, leaving behind only the ugly truth. And yet, as the crowd swarmed around Franklin, there was no satisfaction in my chest. The sense of triumph that I had imagined so vividly in my mind when I first formulated my plan, the rush of victory, was not there. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, a hollow space where revenge had once resided. I stood at the front of the stage, my heart still pounding, my legs shaky from the adrenaline, but the crowd's attention had shifted. Some were calling for help for Franklin, others were pulling back in fear. In the distance, I could hear the faint whine of sirens, but it felt like a distant sound, as if the world was spinning too fast for me to catch my breath. Michael was beside me now, the folder of documents still in his hands. His face, usually calm and composed, was filled with a mix of disbelief and triumph. He had helped me expose the truth, and yet, I could see that the weight of the moment was affecting him too. For all his courage, even he hadn't anticipated how quickly things would spiral out of control. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice shaky as he glanced at the commotion around us. "But now what?" I didn't answer immediately. I had no words. What had I really accomplished? Justice? Yes. But at what cost? Franklin was down, gasping for air, a heart attack surely brought on by the shock of his own exposed guilt. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price, but was that enough? The confusion in Michael's eyes mirrored my own inner turmoil. I had thought that exposing Franklin would feel like a victory, that it would somehow make everything right, that the darkness that had clouded my life for so long would finally lift. But as I looked at him, lying there, barely conscious, the realization settled in. Revenge wasn't what I needed. What I needed was peace. What I needed was closure. I took a step back, feeling the weight of the crowd's gaze upon me. They were all waiting for something. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand what had happened, to see the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. But they weren't going to get that from me. Margaret had disappeared into the crowd after Franklin's collapse, and I knew she would be a problem I'd have to address later. She was an accomplice in his scheme, but she wasn't like him. She had been broken, bent by years of loss and grief, and though she had played her part in my attempted murder, I couldn't bring myself to hate her in the same way. Franklin Cross's life ended in disgrace. The truth had been revealed, and he had died a criminal, his crimes laid bare for all to see. But his death, while poetic in its irony, didn't bring me the closure I had expected. As the paramedics arrived and began to tend to Franklin, I turned away from the stage and walked toward the back of the crowd, my feet dragging through the dirt. Michael followed me, staying close, but giving me space. "Ruby Rosa, what do we do now?" Michael asked again, more insistently this time. I didn't respond at first, but as we moved further from the chaos, I found my voice again. "We finish this," I said, my tone quiet, but firm. "We expose all of it. Every last one of his lies, every forged document, every contract he made under false pretenses. But after that, we let it go. No more vengeance. No more pain." Michael stopped walking, his hand gently resting on my arm. He was quiet for a moment, considering my words. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. "You've been through hell to get here. You deserve to have your revenge." I shook my head, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside me. "It's not about revenge anymore, Michael. It never was. It was about survival. About reclaiming my life. I'm done fighting him. I'm done fighting the past. I need to move on." We continued to walk away from the stage, my feet slow but steady. I had seen the end of one chapter of my life, but there was still so much more to come. The land Franklin had stolen from me, the inheritance that had become the center of so much pain and betrayal, was mine once more. But what would I do with it? What was left to be done with a life that had been broken and rebuilt on such a rocky foundation? We returned to Ida's hut, where I could feel the weight of the silence press down on us. It was a silence I had grown used to, one that followed me everywhere after the burial, a silence that hung in the air like the echoes of a past that refused to let go. But now I had decisions to make. I couldn't live the rest of my life as a prisoner to the past. I had been given a second chance, and it was time to decide what I would do with it. The following days were a whirlwind. News of Franklin's death spread quickly, and with it came the legal battles. The forged land transfer was undeniable, the documents clear in their falsification. But there was more to it than that. The truth about the attempted murder, the lies he had spun for years, was all part of a much bigger story. I had already begun the process of making sure the documents were made public, and soon, there would be no question that I was the rightful owner of the land. As I sat in the quiet of Ida's hut, surrounded by the familiar scents of herbs and firewood, I thought about the future. I thought about the land, the people who worked it, and what I could do with the wealth that had been stolen from me. The more I thought about it, the more I knew what needed to be done. The land wasn't just a treasure trove of precious stones, it was a lifeline for the community. And I would make sure it benefited those who had worked for it, those who had suffered under Franklin's rule. The next few weeks were spent drafting a new plan, a plan that would use the land to build something better. A cooperative, where the workers would own a share of the land, where the profits would go toward improving the town, creating schools, hospitals, and opportunities for those who had been left behind by men like Franklin Cross. As I moved forward with these plans, I could feel the weight lifting from my chest. It wasn't the weight of revenge or anger anymore. It was the weight of responsibility, the kind that comes with having survived the worst and now needing to build something better in its place. And in the quiet moments, when I thought about Ida's words, "Time heals all wounds except an ingrown toenail," I smiled, knowing she was right. It would take time to heal, but with each step, I was becoming the woman I was always meant to be, strong, resilient, and ready to change the world. The days that followed Franklin's collapse were a blur of meetings, decisions, and the slow but inevitable process of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Cedar Falls had changed, its once quiet streets now buzzing with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. News of Franklin's fraudulent empire had spread like wildfire, and the town was now faced with the aftermath of his lies. People were no longer looking at me with fear or suspicion. Instead, they were starting to look at me with respect, as if the woman who had returned from the dead had somehow come back with more than just a story of survival. I was now Ruby Callahan again, no longer the woman buried alive in the desert, but the woman who had clawed her way out, determined to take back what was hers. But there was a difference now, something I couldn't ignore. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the people who had been trampled beneath the weight of Franklin's greed. It was clear to me now that my mission wasn't just about exposing a criminal. It was about creating something sustainable, something that would outlast the pain, the betrayal, and the destruction that had nearly consumed me. The land, the inheritance that Franklin had tried to steal, could be something more than just a piece of property. It could be a foundation for change. I gathered the workers, the ranch hands who had once served Franklin in silence, afraid of losing their jobs if they spoke out. Now they were all looking at me, the woman who had fought for justice, the woman who had survived and returned to claim her legacy. I stood before them one afternoon, as they assembled in the open space behind the house, waiting for what I had to say. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the land. I've been given something that most people only dream of: a second chance, a new life, and the opportunity to make things right. I began, my voice steady but full of emotion. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We've all been living under a lie, under Franklin's rule. His empire was built on betrayal, but now we can build something different. Something lasting. I paused, looking out over the group. Some of them were old, their faces weathered by years of hard work. Others were younger, their eyes filled with the kind of hope that only comes from seeing the possibility of a better future. I've decided to turn this land into a cooperative, I continued. A place where each and every one of you has a stake. Where the land isn't just owned by one person, but shared by all of us. Where the profits go back into the community. Where we can create schools, healthcare, jobs for everyone. This is our chance to build something better, not just for us, but for everyone who has been left behind. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and I could see the spark of something in their eyes, something that had been missing for years: hope. As the days turned into weeks, the details of the cooperative began to take shape. Michael continued to help me with the legal work, ensuring that everything was done above board. We worked with local farmers, laborers, and business owners to create a system where everyone could contribute and benefit. The land that had once been a symbol of Franklin's greed and deceit was now a beacon of possibility for the people of Cedar Falls. But it wasn't just about the land. It was about rebuilding trust. After everything I had been through, it would have been easy to close myself off, to turn my back on the community that had once embraced Franklin's lies. But I couldn't do that. Revenge had been sweet for a moment, but it had left me empty. What mattered now was healing. I visited every corner of the ranch, talking to the workers, learning about their families, their dreams. I saw the weariness in their faces, the long hours they had put in for Franklin with little to show for it. But now, as I listened to their stories, I saw something else. I saw resilience. I saw the strength that had kept them going, even when everything seemed hopeless. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Rebuilding trust would take time. The cooperative was still a new idea, and not everyone was convinced it would work. There were whispers among some of the neighboring ranchers, people who had once looked down on me as nothing more than a maid. They said the cooperative would fail, that it was a foolish dream, and that I was wasting everything I had worked for. But I had learned something in the desert, something I would never forget. Survival wasn't just about fighting to stay alive, it was about holding on to the things that mattered most, even when the world around you was falling apart. And I had learned to trust myself again. Ida, always the pragmatic one, came to visit me one afternoon, bringing with her a small bundle of herbs and a knowing smile. She had become more than just a mentor to me. She had become a reminder of the strength of women who had been through their own battles and had come out the other side stronger. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting beside me on the porch of the house that now felt like home. I looked out over the land, the rolling hills that stretched out before me, the fields where workers were already beginning to plant new crops, where the first signs of reforestation were taking root. The earth had been scarred, but it was healing, just like me. I'm good, Ida. Better than I ever thought I could be. But I'm not doing this alone. It's all of us, together. That's what makes the difference. Ida nodded, her face soft with understanding. You've always been strong, Ruby. But sometimes it takes more than strength. It takes the willingness to let go of the past and build something new. That's the real victory. Her words stuck with me in the days that followed, as the cooperative began to take shape and Cedar Falls began to change. We were no longer the forgotten town on the edge of the desert. We were becoming something more. Months passed, and the cooperative flourished. The land that had once been a battleground for Franklin's greed became a thriving center of prosperity. New businesses opened. Young people who had once been forced to leave town to find work were now staying, starting families, building futures. The schools we established began to educate children who had been denied the chance to learn under Franklin's rule. Healthcare was no longer a luxury for the wealthy, but a basic right for all. The land with the precious stones, which had once been a symbol of Franklin's lust for power, was now being mined sustainably, with care taken to preserve the environment. The profits were reinvested into the community, helping to fund education, healthcare, and social services. I continued to live in the simple home I had built on the land, overlooking the river, watching the seasons change. The world around me had transformed, and so had I. No longer the frightened girl who had trusted the wrong man. I was now a woman who had fought for what was rightfully hers and had turned that fight into something that would benefit everyone. At 88 years old, I knew that I had lived a life full of trials and triumphs. I had learned that true wealth wasn't found in land, or money, or power. It was found in the bonds we build with others, the trust we place in each other, and the legacy we leave behind. And now, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew one thing for sure. The story of my life had become more than just my own. It had become a part of something much larger. A story of survival, of resilience, of transformation, and of a community that would never again be buried by greed. So, to those of you who are struggling, who are still crawling through the dirt, thinking you may never see the light again, hold on. The sun will rise again. You will rise again. And before I go, I ask from the bottom of my heart that you share this story. Like it. Comment. Let me know your thoughts, your experiences. Because there's power in our shared truths. There's healing in the telling. Let's leave our stories, our legacies, for those who come after us. Let them know they are never truly alone. I am Evelyn Miller, but who I was and who I've become are not so different. I am the same woman who once cried in the dark, the same woman who was buried by the world only to rise again with the light of hope in her heart. And now I can say, with all the strength in my soul, I am whole. Thank you for listening, for hearing me, and for allowing me to be part of your story, too. Goodbye for now. May the peace you seek find its way to you, just as the dawn always follows the darkest night.